Hi everyone, my name is Grace and my presentation is about medical apartheid and specifically the role of racism in medical research in the United States. I think that hopefully most of us are aware that medical othering of Black people is a very real, very dangerous aspect of healthcare in America. We know that Black men have the worst health outcomes of any major demographic group. We know that Black women are 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women are. And these statistics are incredibly important, but I think that we tend to look at them on their own and not as something that has a cause, which is why I chose to focus on medical research and experimentation. Because our country has a very long and brutal history of medical research and experimentation on Black people. And by addressing those root causes of disparity and distrust in healthcare, we can start to look at how they've shaped the present and possibly change how they shape the future. So for anybody who wasn't aware, the term apartheid comes from the language of Afrikaans. It means apartness. It was originally used to describe the legally sanctioned racial segregation in South Africa in the late 1900s. But for our purposes, we are looking at the term medical apartheid, which was coined by a medical ethicist named Harriet Washington to describe the racial health gap in the United States today. In her book, which you can see pictured here, and I'd highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in learning more about this topic, she goes through a very detailed history of our history of medical experimentation on Black Americans, starting in colonial times and going up to today. And she talks about a lot, but we're going to use parts of her book as well as many supporting studies to look at these 3 specific examples of medical research and experimentation on Black people. So first, we're looking at medical research on enslaved people and specifically enslaved women in the mid-1800s. Then we'll look at the Tuskegee syphilis study of the mid-1900s. And then we'll look at today's current pharmaceutical testing practices. So starting with medical research on enslaved people, we're looking at the case of Dr. J. Marion Sims, who still today is widely known as and celebrated as the father of modern gynecology. Between 1845 and 1849, he performed dozens, up to 30 painful procedures on enslaved women who had experienced vesicovaginal fistulas during childbirth. According to his autobiography, he experimented on 3 named women and several others who were unnamed. And he was quoted as saying that he could at any day have had a subject for operation, which he did. For 4 years, he performed all of these brutal procedures on women, leaving them with irreparable damage. And he eventually did perfect his treatment for the vesicovaginal fistula. It took him 4 years of failure. And once he was successful, he moved from Alabama to New York and he created a legacy for himself by treating white women with the same condition. Of course, these white women were treated with dignity and respect. They were given anesthesia, which the Black women were not. And they were only given 1 procedure. They weren't subjected to up to 30 procedures. We know for a fact that Anarcha, who was a 17-year-old enslaved girl, was subjected to up to 30 procedures. After 3 days of labor, she was given to Sims by a plantation owner, and she was subjected to 30 painful procedures in the 4 years that he experimented. And then we'll look at the Tuskegee syphilis study, which officially is known as the USPHS syphilis study at Tuskegee. It occurred for 40 long years from 1932 to 1972, and it was in Tuskegee, Alabama, which was known as the Black Belt because its population in the early 1900s was almost completely Black sharecroppers. They had no ability to leave because they had no resources. And actually, even today, Tuskegee is over 97% Black. Now, this study included 600 Black men, 399 of whom had syphilis, but none of them knew that they had syphilis. They were told that they were treated for bad blood, which was a term used to describe an array of illnesses, one of which included syphilis, but it could have also been anemia or fatigue or any other condition like that. And so while they were in this study, they were promised compensation in the form of treatment for that bad blood. They were promised compensation in the form of hot meals, medical exams, and burial payments. Now, of course, they did not receive any treatment. Penicillin, by the start of this study, was already a widely accepted and available treatment for syphilis, but the researchers stated that they wanted to understand the natural course of this disease. They didn't want to understand how well the treatment worked because that was already known. They wanted to know how this disease would occur naturally and the process of the disease in a natural setting without treatment measures. So by 1972, it had been 40 years, several hundred men had died of syphilis. And the study only stopped because in 1972, the media found out. They forced an immediate review of the study, and obviously it was concluded after the review. But it caused irreparable damage to the men of Tuskegee, the families of Tuskegee. All of the men who had syphilis died during the study or shortly after the study. And it has caused, to this day, a distrust in healthcare and specifically in experimental healthcare that we can see in things like the COVID vaccine. We see it in drug trials, which we'll go on to talk about next. It has caused irreparable damage to the trust in healthcare. So one of those things that was affected by Tuskegee was the pharmaceutical testing practices. Black Americans are much less likely to participate in drug trials that may benefit them. And that is in part likely due to a distrust in healthcare. So looking at drug trials, if you aren't aware, the FDA requires pharmaceutical companies to trial their drugs before releasing them to consumers. And these trials include 3 phases. The first phase is safety and dosage. So basically, making sure that this drug is safe to take and will not cause any damage to a person. And then the next 2 phases look at how well the drug works in treatment and any specific side effects it may have. So these phase 1 trials require healthy volunteers because they aren't looking at how well the drug works. They're looking at how safe the drug is. And these healthy volunteers, more than 64% of them are minorities, which is because pharmaceutical companies incentivize people of color with money, food, housing, and healthcare in exchange for their healthy bodies. This is a transactional relationship. It's actually a profession now. People call it guinea pigging because they receive these incentives, this money, the food, they get free housing and free healthcare, which they may not have otherwise. And in return, they just have to give up their body, which of course is extremely advantageous for the pharmaceutical companies and extremely dangerous for the participants who really have no other choice because this may be their only source of income, their only source of housing, or their only source of healthcare. And meanwhile, when we look at the phase 2 and 3 trials, where the populations are people who stand to benefit from the drug, minorities are vastly underrepresented. White people are vastly overrepresented in these trials because they stand to benefit from the drug that's being tested. And we know that part of the reason that minorities are underrepresented is because there's a distrust in experimental healthcare. Another reason is that there's just less access to healthcare in general. They aren't getting the access to these trials. So with minorities overrepresented in the dangerous studies and underrepresented in the beneficial studies, we can see that medical apartheid today in these drug trials. So by addressing the root causes of disparity and dehumanization of Black people in the United States, we can begin to understand the historical components of today's racial health gap and possibly start to look at what our future looks like. For centuries, medical professionals have systematically taken advantage of, dehumanized, and manipulated Black Americans in order to justify a fate that no human could deserve and cultivate ideal care for white Americans. The research has been committed on people who are not fully informed or not consenting, and any research that's committed on a person who's not fully informed or consenting is research that's tainted by abuse and representative of a medical apartheid in the United States, which just contributes to further damage. So here are some of my resources, and here are the others. I would love to hear anybody's thoughts on this topic or on medical apartheid in general in a wider lens. This is a topic that's really important to me, and I've spent a lot of time learning about it, and I would love to hear anybody else's input. Thank you.